Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at the singleton pattern. And the singleton pattern is a design pattern where you have a class and you only allow one instance to be created of that class. You only allow one object to be created from that class. And the singleton pattern is kind of controversial because a lot of people say it introduces global variables by the back door, because once you've got that one object of your class using the singleton pattern, it turns out that you can then access that one object from anywhere in your code. And of course that's potentially dangerous and confusing, and you have to be careful and decide where you're going to use your singleton instance. Really, you have to make a decision about it. And some people say it shouldn't be used at all, in fact, because of this. So a classic example would be a database class, and if you've done any Android programming, then usually in Android you have like the things that your phone does or your Android system does are divided into activities, and any one of them that uses a database would have its own database object typically. And that's a perfectly good way to tackle this problem. If you've got a database object or any object and you want to use it in multiple places in your program, you can just create it somewhere and then pass it around to where you need it. And in fact, often, for example, with a database object, often you really only want to use it in one place anyway, and you would use like the observer pattern to listen to classes, let's say, that required the database. Like if a class needs to use a database, it would fire an event which would tell some listening class to then do something with the database rather than using the database itself. But anyway, nevertheless, let's supposing that you do want to have for example, a database object, and you want to use that potentially in multiple places in your code, but you only want to have one object of that class, then this is how you could handle it. You can use the singleton pattern. So I'll create a class called database in my model package here. And the reason why a database is such a good example of this is that if you have a class like this that handles connecting and disconnecting to a database and then encapsulates a database connection, you don't want to have two of those objects floating around, because then you will have multiple connections open to your database, and usually you only want to have one connection open by your program. So this singleton pattern is a good example of that, because it will enforce only having one object which all your various classes can then use. So I've got my database class here, and let's say I want to use it in this view class, for example. What I would do if I didn't have a singleton would be I'd say database DB, and this could well be a private instance variable, of course. Database DB equals new database. And the disadvantage of this is that I could do that anywhere in my code. I could create a new database object anywhere, and then I'd potentially be opening and closing multiple connections, which might not be good at all. So how can I just force there to only be one of these objects? And the way I do it is, firstly, let's give this a constructor, public database. Now in languages like Java, which allow you to have private constructors, you can actually declare the constructor private, and that prevents anyone doing new on your class anywhere basically, except within the class itself. So to start with, if we're using a language like Java, which allows private constructors and some languages don't, then for your singleton pattern you might want to give it a private constructor, and that will prevent people from doing new on your class other than where you allow it to happen. So let's comment this out. And where are we going to create this database object? And the answer is in the database class. And the way we do it is we have a private static database private variable called instance. So we have a class variable, static variable called instance of the type of the class itself. And we initialize that here, so we say equals new database, and that's the only place in the code where we'll do new on this class. And then finally, so that that can be accessed from outside the class, we give it a public database get instance. And of course, if you're not dealing with a database, then you'll have a different class name in here, because this isn't anything to do with databases. I'm just using this as an example. So we have a public static, in fact, database get instance that returns that static instance reference to the one and only database object. And this is the singleton pattern. And to use that in Vue, for example, we can now do database db equals the class database dot get instance. And now, instead of constructing new databases wherever we want to use this in the code, we're just getting the one and only reference that there is to that database. And that's created right here. Now this is one way to do singleton, and it's generally the recommended way these days. This used to be done usually in a different way, and the way it used to be done and still sometimes is like this. You'd have your public static database get instance, and you'd have your private variable, private static database, let's call this db, because I can't use the same name again. Let's call this get instance old, and then I can call this instance old. So this is the old way of doing it. And then we'll say here, if instance old is equal to null, then instance old equals new database. And then finally we can do return instance old. Let's save that. And this is called lazy instantiation, because the act of creating a new object is called instantiation. And this is lazy instantiation because it doesn't happen until the last possible moment. Until someone calls get instance old, there's no instance of database here, there's no instance of your singleton class. But once they call that for the first time, at that point it's actually created, and from then on instance old will no longer be null, and this won't happen. It will simply return that instance. And this is sometimes a good idea, especially if for some reason you don't want your class to be constructed when your program starts. Let's say that for some reason that will just take too long. You want to speed up the startup of your program, and for some reason want to construct some, I don't know, massive class or something, some massive object later on. Then you can defer creation of it until get instance is called. So that was part of the thinking behind this old way of doing it. But one disadvantage is that this is not thread safe, whereas this probably is, because here what could happen is that one thread could call get instance, and it will say, okay, the instance is null, and then a second thread could call get instance, and it finds instance is null. And then the first thread creates a new instance, and the second thread, which checked if it was null before the first one had got round to creating a new instance, the second thread then also creates a new instance. So now you've got two instances floating around. So this old way of doing it is not thread safe, whereas this is, as far as I can see anyway. So that's why people have drifted towards this a bit. And now you can do this anywhere in your code, which is a disadvantage in many ways, because it is like a global variable. And what I like to do with it here is I want to connect and disconnect from my database. So you can then proceed and add some methods to your class. So let's say, for example, we could have a public void connect, and that will probably throw an exception or something, but for the moment I'll just call it connect, and I'll put in here connected to database. And we could have a disconnect, public void disconnect, and let's say sysout disconnected, just for the moment, disconnected. And where are we going to actually do this? Well, there's really three ways of handling this. One way is that every time you do a query you could connect and disconnect, and that's going to be suitable. This is nothing to do with Singleton, by the way, but just to finish this database stuff. One typical example of that would be if you're connecting to some really little lightweight local database like a SQLite database that just puts its data in a single file for one user, for example, which is common with Android programming. Then you could connect before a query and disconnect afterwards. If the connecting to a database is going to happen in no time at all, then you may as well connect and disconnect liberally. But if you're connecting to some remote database, you might want to connect when your program starts up and disconnect when a program closes. And for that reason here in Swing, I added a window adapter as a window listener, and then when a window opens I can say, well, I could use this here, I could use my DB. But another great thing that that Singleton allows you to do is you can use method chaining, and I can say database.getInstance.connect now, and down here I can say database.getInstance. Whether you do getInstance every time or just once up front just depends really on how many times you need to use it. If you only need to do if you only need to get the reference to the instance like a couple of times, you may as well do it like this. But if you have to call methods of your Singleton, this should be disconnect, repeatedly, then you probably want to get the reference to it up front like this, and then you can just say db.connect, db.disconnect. So now if I run my program, it connects when a window opens and disconnects when it closes. And the third possibility is to use connection pooling, which is pretty easy to do in using servlets and JSPs. And I think for Swing there's something called, I think it's called C3PO, like the robot in Star Wars, but I've never used it, so I don't know. But connection pooling, where you just grab a connection from a pool and use it, and then don't worry about it anymore because it will remain in the pool anyway, is a really great way to handle it if you don't mind going to the trouble of setting that up. So the essence of the Singleton pattern is it's when you want to have just one object, and you might want to use it in multiple places, and you have this private instance variable, you have a method to retrieve it, and you create the instance within the class itself. Usually you make the constructor private if you can, which you can in Java. You give it whatever methods you want, and then when you use it you can say class name.getInstance such and such to call the methods, or you can retrieve the methods up front with getInstance. Sorry, you can retrieve the reference up front, the instance, with getInstance, and then use it like db.connect or whatever, for example. So that's a Singleton. It is a bit controversial and some people refuse to use it, but I find it is sometimes quite handy. And that's it for this tutorial. I'll put this code on caveofprogramming.com, or you'll be able to find some kind of link to it there anyway. And until next time, happy coding.
Thanks for watching, guys. Don't hesitate. If you have any doubts or question, leave a comment below. Hope you learned something new today. Subscribe to my channel for more.